Week. Today is November the 17th, 2025. My first guest this morning, a name you know well, the State Auditor Shad White. He joins us in studio as we start things off. Well, we can not start things off. We keep rolling in the 7 o'clock hour. Good morning.
Good morning, man. How you doing?
Doing well. Appreciate some of your time.
Yeah.
Hey, we're talking before the break about the Epstein files. You've been big on transparency in everything you do within the state auditor's office. President with a bit of a reversal last night with a Truth Social post late where he said, hey, just Republicans, just vote for it. Just release it all.
Yeah.
What do you make of all this? Is the political winds seem to have blown this story back and forth, back and forth?
Yeah, I mean, I very briefly saw the president's Truth Social post, and, you know, like he said, he's got nothing to hide, and he's happy for it to come out. You know, I kind of think that, just speaking more generally about what's going on right now, I think there very clearly is some internal squabbling just on the right, and that's probably just a natural consequence of how politics works. You know, during an election, everyone knew how bad Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were, and so everybody sort of rallied around the flag to beat them. And then, you know, just as soon as we win, everyone starts to snipe internally a little bit, and you just kind of hate to see that. But that's a natural part of politics. I think that'll continue to happen, unfortunately, on a bunch of different kinds of issues as conservatives sort out, you know, what the future of the movement, what the future of the MAGA movement looks like. And you know, President Trump is going to loom large over those conversations for the next few years because he's still the president, and it's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how all of that plays out.
It is the nature of politics, but I've always argued that it's more the nature of Republican politics than it is Democrats. They squabble amongst themselves, but then when it comes down to it, they all vote the same way. They all stick together when an issue comes up, other than reopening the government. There were a few that finally came across the line. Why is it that Republicans seem to be the ones that do that? When they get power, they a lot of times squander it as opposed to consolidating it and really kind of coming forward with change.
I agree with you. Democrats tend to just get in line. And you can see it in some of these votes. You know, there'll be internal squabbling on their side, but then when it comes time to vote in Congress, you know, there'll be unanimous votes with Hakeem Jeffries. And Republicans tend to not do that. So on the one hand, I think that's a strength for us. I think it's a strength that conservatives think for themselves, and we have these big debates because that means that ideally the best possible ideas float to the surface. On the other hand, it can sometimes stand in the way of us getting things done. You know, there was a period where it looked like the one big beautiful bill might not get done, and that was critical because if it had not gotten done, there would be massive tax increases on normal Americans. And I think President Trump, by force of personality, has pushed through a lot of those disagreements. And now the big question is, you know, who's the next generation of leaders that's going to come along, and are they going to be able to forge coalitions on the right to get stuff done, and what do those coalitions believe, and what are they going to do? It's going to be fascinating. It's going to be an interesting few years in politics.
Along those lines, though, Shad, you kind of fall into that category, don't you? You have had your fair share of debates and disagreements with people within the Republican Party in Mississippi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's healthy in general. You know, there are some folks who I think engage in it in a way that's not healthy. So, for example, you know, last year we had to fight off multiple attempts to, you know, really erode the legal authority of the auditor's office and then cut our budget or restrain our budget. That's not productive, and I thought that was more a series of acts of political revenge as opposed to a big, robust debate about the future of the party. But there are other times when we're actually debating issues, and I think that is productive. So, for example, you know, a couple of years ago, I started raising the topic of DEI at our universities, and I had several Republicans who came to me and said, you don't need to be talking about that. That's not that big of a deal. It's not that widespread of a problem. And so I think that's actually a healthy conversation to have, to really explore what DEI is, how it is corrupting the minds of young people at the universities, how much taxpayer money we're spending on that. And then, you know, if I have a better argument, I win, and if you have a better argument, you win. And you see policies that result from all that.
There is a conversation that's kind of in its infancy right now. We're waiting on the results of the Supreme Court decision in Louisiana versus Calais. Mm-hmm. And at issue there, a lot of it is some of the Voter Rights Act. from the 60s. And the case, I suppose, is fairly complicated, but it sounds like the Supreme Court is going to side with the state of Louisiana and say that, redrawing or drawing congressional district lines simply based on race is not constitutional.
Yep.
I've asked the question of a number of people who are Republican pundits or even elected officials, hey, depending on the results of this, if the Supreme Court sides with the state of Louisiana, do you see Mississippi redrawing its congressional lines? And for the most part, the reaction has been like, I don't know that Mississippi will go down that road.
Oh, we 100% should. We absolutely should.
I think you're the only statewide official that has come out and has openly said that Mississippi should redraw its congressional lines based on that.
Yeah.
At least the only one that I've heard.
Yeah, same. I don't see a ton of other statewide elected officials talking about this. But look, we have a district that's specifically drawn to protect Benny Thompson. And it's gerrymandered. If you look at the map, it snakes along the Mississippi River and then it juts out to grab voters through the middle of the state. That's bad. We should not do that. I mean, Benny Thompson's a terrible congressman, but we should have simpler districts that just reflect normal geographic communities. And if you do that, you're going to end up, I think, with better members of Congress who have to represent both black folks and white folks. The way the lines are drawn right now, Benny Thompson's really only got to worry about his voters, meaning the voters in the Democratic Party, so that he can keep winning the Democratic primary. And this leads, just in general, if you do that everywhere in the country, it leads to polarization. You're going to have some really extreme Republicans and really extreme Democrats. Well, maybe we should just draw simple districts and get the best people in those districts. And I'll tell you, Richard, I think the reason why you don't hear a lot of Republicans who will say this out loud is two reasons. Number one is they don't want to be called a racist. So if you stand up and you say we shouldn't have districts specifically drawn to around racial lines, a lot of conservatives even will say, oh gosh, I don't want Mississippi Today to write an article about how racist I am. Well, I got over that 4 or 5 years ago. I don't care what anybody thinks. I think we should just tell the truth and do things that fit with common sense. And number two, unfortunately, some Republicans realize that some of their buddies are protected by gerrymandering, and so they don't want to make their buddies mad. These are not good reasons to make a policy decision. What we should do is we should have good common sense districts that are geographically cohesive, that are just, as compact and as normal looking as you can possibly get. That should be the goal.
Along the lines of your second point, and this may be saying the same thing but in a different way, there are some people that go, look, you've got 3 slam dunk Republican wins. Even though Congressional District 2, you're probably not getting rid of Benny Thompson, and when he finally is out of office, there'll just be another Benny Thompson that slides into his seat. How much does that play into it?
I don't think that's right, and I think the people who are saying that haven't played with maps. So there are these pieces of software that you can go and you can look at, and you can write your own, draw your own Mississippi congressional maps, and very easily you can draw 4 pretty normal-looking districts that would be majority Republican districts, because Mississippi is a very, very red state. You look at Connecticut. I think Connecticut has 5 congressional seats. 42% of folks in Connecticut voted for President Trump, and they have all 5 seats drawn to be for Democrats. All 5 are held by Democrats.
Well, California is the same way.
California is the same way. So Mississippi and a lot of other red states are really at the other end of the spectrum. We specifically have gone out of our way to draw districts for Democrats when the Democrats are heavily benefiting from gerrymandering in these other states. So
if you were redrawing them, would it be 4 quadrants where you've got basically 4 corners, or would you use horizontal lines and just run the horizontal lines based on population and have it north to south 4 districts?
Well, I think in general what I would say is you need to have simpler districts that don't look like snakes or spiders running across the state. Now, it's really difficult to just draw straight lines, because what you don't want to do is you don't want to split up counties. You don't want to split up cities, right? You don't want a line going through the middle of Greenville, Mississippi, and on this side of the line, I vote in this congressional district, and you vote on the other in the other congressional district. So you have to do some line drawing, and of course you have to have districts that are of roughly equal population, But look, I am just telling you, like, there are maps that are floating out on the internet. You can draw your own maps. I believe that there are maps that exist in the upper levels of the Republican Party nationally of Mississippi that do create common sense districts that would make 4 districts that lean Republican at the very least.
So you would run the risk of drawing lines that look less gerrymandered, even if it brought into the possibility of having perhaps 2 Democrats as opposed to just one.
I just don't think that you're going to have a map that looks like it has 2 Democrat districts in there. And I would challenge you, go play with the district lines, and you'll see very quickly, oh, wait, this is not like 2 districts where it's within a couple points of being Democrats. We got to
take a break. We'll be right back. We'll pick this up on the other side with Shad White. Welcome again. It's Mornings with Richard Cross, SuperTalk Mississippi. Shad White, the state auditor in the state of Mississippi, is my guest, and appreciate his time this morning. Crime Stoppers is something that we've been told for much of our life, that if we just call the number and we drop a tip that leads to an arrest, we'll get a reward, and they're doing great things. Got a report last week that Crime Stoppers in DeSoto County not really stopping much crime, and not sure where the allocated dollars for that entity are actually going. What's up with that?
Yeah, it was a pretty wild audit result that we got. So just to back up a little bit, my office has for the last several months been looking at taxpayer dollars that go from the government to nonprofits, and then unfortunately a lot of times just get lit on fire, get completely wasted. And as you know, Richard, we've had cases where some of that money's been stolen even. So when we produce these reports, we always tell the public, hey, if you know of nonprofits that we should be looking at that receive taxpayer funds, let us know. And so we got a tip in about DeSoto County Crime Stoppers where someone was concerned based on good, reasonable evidence that the Crime Stoppers chapter up there was not doing much. So we looked at the documents, we gathered all of their expenditure data, and what we found was that over the course of the last 10 years, Crime Stoppers in DeSoto County had spent about $400,000, but they could not show us a single piece of evidence that suggested that they had collected any tips for law enforcement, nor could they show us any evidence that they had paid out a single reward to anybody who had turned over information to law enforcement. Instead, what we found is that about 60% of that money had gone to pay for the salary of the person running Crime Stoppers. And then there were some other sort of nonsense expenditures, like a ton of money paid to ship some calendars from Horn Lake to Hernando. So if you're not from North Mississippi, those places are only
not far apart.
Not far apart, about 13 miles apart. So the staffer could have easily driven the calendars from one place to the other. That's the kind of stuff that we were seeing in terms of the expenditures. And you know, we produced this report, and I didn't know if it would get a ton of notice, but it ended up getting a ton of notice in DeSoto County, I think because people really care about crime and public safety in DeSoto County. One of the top issues for voters and taxpayers up there is they don't want crime from Memphis to spill over into their safe communities in DeSoto County. So this was a big issue.
Is there a limit to the jurisdiction of the state auditor's office when it comes to entities that are operating inside Mississippi?
So the statute that governs the auditor's office says that we have the power to look at state agencies, government agencies, nonprofits, or for-profit companies if they are spending taxpayer funds. So in this case, for DeSoto County Crime Stoppers, we can go and look at them because they're a nonprofit spending taxpayer funds. There is no lower bound limit on like the dollar amount. Now, the legislature tried to put a limit onto us and said that, well, if there's a nonprofit that's getting less than a certain amount of public funds, Shad White should not be able to go look at those nonprofits, and he should not be able to look and see how they're spending money. And my question back to them was, well, if not me, then who? Who is going to be doing any kind of oversight of those nonprofits, even if they're only spending $1 million of taxpayer funds? So we're just going to trust them. So I think a lot of voters saw it that way. That's why a ton of people called the legislature, and that bill that was going to do that eventually died. But there is no lower bound limit on the dollar amount that we can look for.
So hypothetically, if you wanted or your office wanted to audit, let's say the officiating program from a major conference that has 2 representatives in the state of Mississippi, that wouldn't necessarily be within your purview?
If they're spending taxpayer money, it's in my purview. There's this issue of judgment about whether or not we, go after every single person. You have to prioritize. But I take your point. I'm interested in football too, so there's always a way to get into like taxpayer funds at our field houses and all that kind of stuff.
My good friend Brian Haydad, who I worked with in the afternoons daily for a really long time, he's not really into politics. In fact, like if you say something political, he just turns and runs the other way. But I think this might be the way to get him into politics if you could figure out a way to audit the officials that work in the Southeastern Conference. He might become like your biggest donor.
Yeah, I think maybe it was last year before, when there was a rumor that Lane Kiffin might be headed to either Alabama or Auburn, one or the other.
I think it was Auburn in 2022.
Right, that's exactly right. I threatened on Twitter to audit every single person in Alabama, and I think some people thought that was serious. That's a touch outside my jurisdiction, but I would be willing to try. That's all I'm saying. I would be willing to try to audit all the people in Florida if they steal Lane Kiffin from us.
Visiting with Shad White, state auditor here in Mississippi. We're almost 2 weeks removed from special elections. Had very low turnout in those. Kind of goes back to the redistricting conversation that we had a little while ago. We were talking about congressional districts, but we had court-ordered redrawing of state congressional district lines, and there was a net gain for Democrats in Mississippi. The Republicans lost the supermajority in the Senate. What did you take away from the results of that election? Because one of the things we talked about was the National Party, the DNC, putting some money into those races in Mississippi in places that they thought they saw some vulnerable seats.
Yeah, my takeaway was that we were going to lose those seats because a court had told the state that we had to draw special districts around racial lines, unfortunately. And my personal opinion is that Mississippi should have fought that court decision all the way as far as it could have gone all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. The state chose not to do that. So we ended up with these districts, and we lost as a result. And the reason we lost is if you dig into like one of those districts in DeSoto County, I think that we lost was like an 80-20 black-white district. We're going to lose that district. Republicans are going to lose that district, unfortunately. I wish that voting lines weren't so racially polarized, but they are, unfortunately. And, it didn't matter what Republicans did up there. We were going to lose that race. So, again, really the problem here, I think, is that we need fairer districts that are not drawn around racial lines, that are not as gerrymandered, so that we can have just a fair up or down vote, and we can ideally elect the best candidates. That's the solution.
The Republican proverbial water cooler has had some interesting conversations over the last few months, and those conversations are going to continue to heat up over the next few months as we move closer to a big election year in the state of Mississippi. Your name has been bandied about for a number of offices outside the one that you currently are in. Now, before you go all coach speak and say, I'm the state auditor and I'm focused on doing the best job that I can do in the office that I have right now.
Trust the process.
Where are you? You've admitted to me in the past that you've toyed with the idea of a run for the governor, but I've heard your name mentioned as a possibility in a run for lieutenant governor, for attorney general. Where are you on that?
Well, look, I want to do good work that is both meaningful to me and moves the state forward. And so, I continually pray and think about that and where my skill set fits. Look, I'll just say this. Let's go back to that conversation about these districts and Benny Thompson. I am frustrated that there are not a ton of other conservatives or Republicans, at least, who will step up and say the things that I've said in the last 15 minutes, that we need to have common sense district lines and we don't need to have a gerrymandered district, especially for Benny Thompson. Now, the proof here that you could achieve some really good things for the state is in this issue. Like if we had good district lines, you would have 4 congressmen who on net are better than the 3+1 that we have right now. So we need leaders who will stand up and say hard truths and fight tough fights, even when they get called mean names. And so my question is, who is that next set of leaders, and where do I fit in that group? And if there's nobody willing to step up and fight these fights, then yeah, that is a motivating factor for me for pursuing one of the top offices. And I've made no secret that I'm seriously thinking about running for governor. And it's really for this reason, that we have to have fighters. We have to have people who will step up. They're not worried about what's going to be written about them in the newspaper. They just want to do the right thing and the common sense thing. And unfortunately, I don't see a ton of that among some of the folks who are talking about running for other things in 27.
When will you ultimately make that decision?
You know, I think it's too soon right now because we're still 2 years out. So it's November of 25. You know, so we're a couple of years out from a general election. I'm going to keep doing my job. I'm going to keep traveling the state, talking to people about my vision for the future of Mississippi, and then next year sometime it'll be time, I think, to make a call.
If the people of Mississippi will have you, do you anticipate being in public office for another 8 to, 16, 24 years, or do you see a transition into the private sector?
For that conversation, we will have to bring in my wife, Richard. I can get her on speed dial, but it might not be a popular decision at this time in the morning. I don't know. I know that I want to achieve things for the state of Mississippi, and we'll see how far that takes me. And if that means leaving public office at some point, I'm fine with that too.
If we brought my wife into that conversation about me, it would be a very short conversation. Shad, always appreciate your time. Good stuff this morning. Thanks.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate you.
State Auditor Shad White. We'll wrap up the 7 o'clock hour next with you on Mornings with Richard Cross.